1977. I began keeping this diary in part due to an offhand comment by Richard Nixon. Rosa and I first met Nixon when we attended the National Governors Conference in 1971. The president walked up to us at a White House reception, turned to Rosa and asked, "Young lady, do you keep a diary?" Rosa replied, "No, sir." Nixon then said, "You'll be sorry." Since this was our first conversation with the president, it made a lasting impact. Within a day or two of my inauguration, I began making written notes of my thoughts and activities on the pages of a legal pad, and on February 26, I began dictating into a small tape recorder, more frequently and currently.
Thursday, January 20th. A couple of months before the inauguration, I got a letter from Senator Proxmire, who is very interested in physical fitness. He suggested that I walk from the Capitol to the White House on Inauguration Day. I responded without making any promise, and about 3 weeks before the inauguration, I informed the Secret Service that I would do so. I later told my wife, my son Chip, and no one else until the night before inauguration, at which time I told Vice President Mondale and a couple of staff members, including Jody Powell. I thought it would be a good demonstration of confidence by the new president in the people of our country as far as security was concerned, and also would be a tangible indication of some reduction in the imperial status of the president and his family. We were gratified at the response. Many people along the parade route, when they saw that we were walking, began to weep, and it was an emotional experience for us as well. I was surprised at the enormous attention this act received from the news media and believe it was a good decision. I think the inauguration speech itself, perhaps one of the briefest on record for the first inauguration of a president, was quite compatible with my announcement speech in December 1974, and also with my acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention. It accurately expresses some of the major themes of my administration. Even though I had been preparing to be president, I was genuinely surprised when, in the benediction by the bishop from Minnesota, he referred to blessings on President Carter. Just the phrase, President Carter, was startling to me. I would say that the quarters at the White House were quite similar to those we enjoyed as the governor's family in Georgia, but I have been constantly impressed, I almost said overwhelmed, at the historical nature of the White House, occupied for the first time by our second president, John Adams. When I see a desk or a writing cabinet or a book or a sideboard or a bed that was used by Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt or Truman or Kennedy, I have a feeling of almost unreality about my being president, but also a feeling of both adequacy and determination that I might live up to the historical precedents established by my predecessors. That night, we had our first of what has been a very relaxed and informal series of meals with our family. Early on, when Rosalynn was visiting the White House, some of our staff asked the chef and cooks if they thought they could prepare the kind of meals which we enjoyed in the South, and the cook said, "Yes, ma'am, we've been fixing that kind of food for the servants for a long time." The meals in general have been superb. The only shock was that for the first 10 days, our food bill in the White House was $600. Part of this was carelessness because we didn't let the cooks know when some of our family members would not be present. Part of it was because of the excessive amount of company that we had the first few days. We quickly discovered that the president himself pays for all personal meals, gifts, and travel, for himself and for other family members as well. All official expenses are, of course, paid by the government. January 21st. We had a series of receptions for people that we cared about, the first one of which was for 700 or 800 Americans with whom we had spent the night during the long campaign. In some instances, this was an emotional meeting because they had meant so much to us when no one knew or cared who I was, and we had formed such close personal friendships with them, and had not had a chance to thank them adequately. I was genuinely surprised at how deeply moved I was to see these people. We gave each one of the families a small brass plaque stating that a member of my family had stayed with them during the campaign. The first couple days we shook hands with literally thousands of people in receiving lines. Quite important to do this, to thank people who had helped us, to cement ties with the members of Congress, the diplomatic officials, and also with the members of the armed forces. I was particularly impressed as the leaders of the military branches came by and shook hands with me and Rosalyn to find the extraordinary number who made some reference to their prayers for us or "God be with you," statements of that kind, much more than had been the case with others during those 2 days. My normal, almost unvarying routine is to get up at 6:30, sometimes earlier if I have special work to do, get to the office at about 7. Most mornings I spend an hour to an hour and a half by myself reading the paper, writing memoranda to my staff members, and I have a security briefing by Dr. Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, my national security advisor, reading the CIA's intelligence report to the president, meet with Hamilton Jordan and Frank Moore, my liaison officer with the Congress, to go over the day's business with the Congress or other matters, and then I start my regular appointments. For the first couple of weeks I did all this out in the Oval Office, but later moved into a more private small office on the west side of the West Wing. The Oval Office is quite impressive, and I've noticed that many of my long-standing friends, quite self-assured and sometimes cosmopolitan, are not urbane when they come into the Oval Office, become almost completely inarticulate, get nervous and unsure of themselves, impressed greatly by the fact that this is the center of our government. One of the almost routine problems I have is to put them at ease so we can continue with the conversation that brought them there. January 22nd. We continued our series of receptions, but had our first National Security Council meeting to get organized. This was an organization that in the past had consisted of, I think, 7 different committees, and we cut this down to 2 different committees. I've been determined to have Dr. Brzezinski be a constant source of stimulation for the Department of Defense and State, but always work in the role of a staff person to me. In fact, I've pledged that none of the members of my staff would dominate members of the cabinet. Zbig agrees completely with this, and because of his constant access to me several times each day, perhaps second only to Hamilton Jordan in frequency, his influence over my own thinking and judgment, ultimate decisions, is certainly adequate.
As a college student, Hamilton had volunteered to help me in my campaign for governor in 1966. 4 years later, after serving in Vietnam, he became my top political leader. He was my executive secretary in the governor's office and the primary strategist in planning and conducting our presidential campaign. In the White House, he continued to be one of my key advisors. Although he did not want any titles, he effectively served as my chief of staff. Everyone in my administration and in Congress recognized Hamilton as the most influential of my advisors in Washington.